When I started my investigations 40 years ago or more, I was obsessed particularly with the problem of evil, and mostly from a psychological perspective. And the question for me, in a nutshell, I suppose, was, what's it like to be an Auschwitz camp guard who enjoys his work? And that's not a question that people usually ask, because they don't conceive of themselves as the sorts of beings who could do that, much less enjoy it. And that always struck me as dangerously naive. Anyways, the consequence of investigating that question was that I became, for whatever it's worth, unshakably convinced that evil was a reality. And maybe in some ways, like an undeniable and fundamental reality, something akin to the reality of pain. Now, what that did for me was highlight out something that was the reverse of that by implication. Because if you can imagine hell in its darkest reaches, you can posit the existence of something that's antithetical to that. Now, it's always been more difficult for me to conceptualize what might be the essence of good than it is to conceptualize the essence of evil. I actually think it's easier in some ways to put your finger on evil. But once you do that, there's an implication that immediately emerges, which is, well, there's some pathway to hell, obviously, since we can create it on earth and have done that repeatedly in our own private lives, say, and sociologically and politically. That strongly implies that there's a pathway in the other direction towards something that's the opposite. And that's been much more difficult to flesh out. But for me, that was the existential grounding of my belief in something approximating a transcendent good. At least the transcendent good is the pathway away from, let's say, the worst excesses of Auschwitz.
No, this is good, because I'm with you on this. And I think, again, the majority of philosophers think that there is something called evil, but maybe they use different ways of describing it. It's interesting you described evil as pain there, but at the same time, we can cash out pain in terms of higher order goods that pain gives rise to. So, I take the injection, so I'm immune from X, Y, and Z, and, the pain was worth it. It wasn't a gratuitous or a necessary bit of pain. And so it's not evil in that sense. And likewise, when it comes to Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, the pain and the suffering of the individuals who died at the hands of these weapons or of these regimes were themselves the victims of what they might conceive to be as evil or as gratuitous suffering. But the Christian says something, well, they've said it for a long time, right? That there are Theodicies and defenses that one can give on behalf of God to get God off the hook there, that it's greater to have free will and do these things than not. And people like Richard Swinburne, the popular philosopher of religion defending Christianity, he defends things like the Holocaust and defends the dropping of the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And that's a real bitter pill for a lot of atheists and agnostics to swallow. I do think that these defenses and theodicies collectively can respond to the argument from evil, the evidential version, that is. But there is a new version. There are several new versions of the problem of evil that are coming out recently. And I think the most dangerous of all of them is what Eugen Nagasawa, a Christian himself, describes as the systemic problem of evil. And he says, a perfectly good God, the challenge goes, would not gear the system, rig the rules to give rise to life as evolution by natural selection. That's not a system that God would put in place. It necessitates the pain and suffering of countless sentient creatures, and there is no way of getting consciousness and intelligent life without them. Ultimately, he says that actually that problem's a big problem for atheists as well, because he thinks atheists like Richard Dawkins are what he calls existential optimists. They think the world is on the whole a good place, and they're happy and pleased to be alive. Yet the same person is happy to run the problem of evil against theists, but maintain their own optimism. So he thinks that if you're an atheist, you can't be an optimist, and you must be a pessimist. But if you're a theist, and you've got strong arguments for theism, belief in God, then you can appeal to this broader metaphysics, kingdom of heaven, God's ultimate plan, and the like. And so the theist, he thinks, has the better hand against the atheist. But ultimately, I think that argument works against him. And Eugen's a philosophical hero of mine, so I don't say it lightly. But you know what they say, to borrow from Aristotle, Plato's dear to me, but dearer still is truth. I think he actually shoots himself in the foot because I don't think it's reasonable to believe in a perfectly good God and evolution by natural selection at the same time. And there is questions to be asked there about, and this goes back to the start of our conversation, and working as part of the Inner Experience project at Durham University, we look at the conscious experiences of all things we consider to have capacities for subjective experience. And the question is, can these non-human animals experience pain and suffering in any way, shape, or form that we can? And I think most of us think that's the case. 90% of people in the UK.
It's the simplest biological explanation. Otherwise, you have to posit that the systems in animals that are akin to ours and very, very akin operate in some qualitatively different manner. And that's not a useful Occam's razor hypothesis. It's animals obviously experience pain. Look, from my perspective, the proper position with regards to especially complex animal existence is that you assume continuity until you can demonstrate discontinuity. That's the simplest explanation. Now, you said a bunch of things there that were interesting, so let me respond to a couple of them. So in the story of Job again, Job has every reason to shake his fist at God and die, to claim, in some sense, what the antinatalists claim, to claim that existence, like Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust, claims that the existential situation that characterizes reality is so dismal in its essence that it would be better if the whole thing was just brought to a halt. That consciousness itself, even being, is a reprehensible exercise in light of the suffering that's ultimately generated. Now, for Goethe, that was Mephistopheles speaking. And that's very interesting because, of course, Mephistopheles isn't one of the world's most positive characters. And so you might say, well, and by the way, Mephistopheles was a great hero to Karl Marx. And Mephistopheles does make this argument, and that's the spirit he stands for, is the adversary of being itself. Being is so rife with suffering that it's inexcusable in its essence. And that's, in some sense, that's the impetus to suicide, right? And it's understandable. Now, one of the ways that I've dealt with that, let's say, psychologically and conceptually, is to, I suppose it's a by their fruits you will know them argument. My sense is that if you take the seeds that grow from that, or the fruit that grows from those seeds, that those fruits are bitter and evil, that if you adopt the antinatalist perspective, and look, it's perfectly obvious why it's justifiable, because the world is saturated in suffering. And it isn't obvious to me that there's a way of balancing the evidence, so to speak, to decide on which side of the scales you would place your conclusion. Partly because how the hell do you weight the evidence?
Yeah.
Dostoevsky's, or go ahead.
This is great. This is an interesting point of agreement. And I'd like to have seen this come out in your discussion with Musk, because I think he pointed to a form of agnosticism to begin with. And then when talking about antinatalism, he said something along the lines of, it's obviously ridiculous to think that the world is just suffering. And to quote to paraphrase the late, great Dan Dennett, he said that we should only begin to criticize our opponents after we express their ideas in such a way that they go, oh, I wish I put it like that. That's great. And I don't think the antinatalist says everything is suffering, as you pointed out there. They say the world has more suffering than it does happiness, that all happiness and pleasure is bracketed in suffering and pain. This is the Buddhist idea, the Schopenhauerian idea, the views of David Benatar and David Pearce, the negative utilitarians who want to eliminate suffering. And that means, and I asked David Pearce this, a transhumanist, I asked him once, well, if you're a negative utilitarian and you think the moral goal is to remove suffering, why don't you just blow up the world? Why don't you just give us drugs that make us feel nothing? And he said, well, I don't think I'm going to get voted in if I say I'm going to blow up the world, but I certainly would like to do it. And it's like, you got to admire the honesty there, right? Maybe he should start telling a few politicians lies to get himself to what he takes to be the moral end. But ultimately, though, I think you're exactly right that the problem with trying to quantify, measure the amounts of good and evil that's in the world is a hopeless project. We can't, and you mentioned evil God a moment ago. There's this popular challenge in philosophy of religion that says, look at all the good and evil in the world. Who's to say that God is good rather than evil? And that's the essence of that challenge. And it works because it's really hard to quantify these things, especially when you're not just counting pains, pleasures, happinesses and the like, but you're also seeing what goods and bads they ultimately lead to. You can play that game all day long. But there's one thing that the anti-antinatalist has up their sleeve, and that's to say that existence itself is intrinsically good. Existence and being sit at the top of Jacob's ladder. That given the choice, and take John Rawls, you mentioned Marx, let's use another lefty-looking political figure in political theory. John Rawls said, imagine you're behind this veil of ignorance and you've got to create the world. And we can change this a bit for the purposes of our discussion. Now, you're given the choice whether to bring in life and conscious beings and not. You don't know how much happiness, pain, pleasure they're going to experience, how much suffering they're going to experience when they're in the world. And he asks, well, we're asking on behalf of Rawls, would you bring things into being still, not knowing how much happiness and suffering they'd experience? I think we'd all say yes still. I think there is no person that I know of anyway that legitimately defends the intrinsic disvalue of life. Even David Benatar, the most prominent antinatalist, doesn't think that life is intrinsically bad. He thinks that the suffering and pain in the world overrides the intrinsic goodness of the world. And I think that is ultimately something that goes in the anti-natalist's favor.